We found a locked chest, buried beneath the floorboards. The note inside said my mother wasn't who I thought she was. Hi everyone, before we get into today's video, I need your help. We've noticed that the channel's reach has been dropping a bit, and one of the best ways you can support us is by subscribing. It's quick, free, and helps us keep bringing you new and interesting stories. Your support means the world to us, and together we can grow this channel. Thank you so much. Now let's get to today's story. I'm writing from a temporary account for obvious reasons, and I've changed some details to protect my anonymity. The house still smelled the same after all these years. Old wood and lavender sachets, dust, and something indefinable that belonged only to this place. I stood in the doorway of my childhood home, keys heavy in my hand, and felt the weight of 37 years pressing down on my shoulders. My mother had died 3 weeks ago. Quietly, in her sleep, the way she'd done most things in life. No drama. No fuss. Just there one moment and gone the next, leaving behind this Victorian house with its creaking floors and too many rooms and me, her only child, to figure out what to do with all of it. I'd driven 6 hours from the city, taken a week off work, and arrived on a gray October afternoon when the leaves were falling like rust-colored rain. The house looked smaller than I remembered, shabbier, its blue paint peeling in places, the garden overgrown with weeds my mother had been too frail to tend in her final years. I'd offered to hire someone to help her. She'd refused. She always refused help, always insisted on handling things herself, on keeping the world at arm's length. Even me, especially me. I turned the key and stepped inside. The interior was exactly as I remembered it, frozen in time like a museum to a life I'd never fully understood. The same threadbare Persian rug in the hallway, the same dark wood furniture, heavy and old-fashioned, the same photographs on the mantel me at various ages, always alone, never with friends or extended family. Just me and her, Margaret Hayes and her son Daniel, a complete unit of two. No pictures of my father. I'd asked about him once when I was 7, and my mother had given me a look so cold it had scared me into silence. He's gone, she'd said. That's all you need to know. I never asked again. I walked through the rooms slowly, cataloging everything that would need to be sorted, sold, donated, or thrown away. A lifetime of possessions that would need to be reduced to boxes and decisions. The furniture could be sold, the clothes donated, the books, hundreds of them. My mother had been a voracious reader, could go to the library. But there were other things, personal things. Letters tied with ribbon in her desk drawer, a jewelry box with a few pieces that might have been valuable, photo albums I'd never seen before, stored in the back of her closet. I'd planned to start with the easy stuff: clothes, kitchenware, obvious trash. But I found myself drawn upstairs, to the room that had been mine as a child. The room I hadn't set foot in since I'd left for college at 18 and never really come back. The door stuck slightly, swollen with humidity, and opened with a screech that echoed through the empty house. Inside, everything was preserved like a time capsule. My old bed, still made with the same blue quilt. My desk, still holding pencils in a Star Wars mug. Posters on the walls, bands I'd loved, movies I'd seen dozens of times. It was like walking into my own past. I sat on the bed, and it groaned under my adult weight. The mattress sagged in the middle, springs protesting. I lay back, staring at the ceiling where glow-in-the-dark stars still clung in constellations I'd arranged when I was 12. That's when I heard it. A creak, different from the usual settling of an old house. It came from beneath me, from the floor itself. I sat up, frowning, and the sound came again, a definite give in the floorboards. Curious, I got down on my hands and knees and pressed on the boards. Most were solid, but near the foot of the bed, one section shifted slightly under my weight. I pushed harder, and the board lifted at one end, revealing a gap underneath. My heart started beating faster. I went downstairs and found a screwdriver in the kitchen junk drawer. My mother had been oddly handy, always fixing things herself rather than calling someone. Back upstairs, I used the screwdriver to pry up the loose board. It came away easily, and beneath it was a space about 2 feet square, carved out between the joists. And in that space, covered in decades of dust and cobwebs, was a metal chest. It was old, the kind you might see in an antique store with a rusted lock and tarnished brass hinges. I pulled it out carefully. It was heavy, solid, and set it on the floor. The lock was intact but corroded. I tried the screwdriver, wiggling and prying, and after a few minutes of effort, the lock mechanism gave way with a snap. I opened the chest. Inside were papers. Lots of them. Old photographs with serrated edges, yellowed envelopes, a leather journal with a cracked spine, birth certificates, medical records. And on top of everything, a folded piece of paper that looked newer than the rest. I unfolded it with trembling hands. The handwriting was my mother's, precise and controlled, the same script I'd seen on birthday cards and grocery lists my entire life. But the words made my blood run cold. Daniel, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and you found what I never wanted you to find. I'm sorry. I know that's inadequate, but it's all I have. The woman you called mother, that was me, but it wasn't the whole truth. My real name wasn't Margaret Hayes. I changed it 38 years ago, before you were born. I erased my past because I had to, because I was running. Everything I told you was a lie. Where I came from, who I was, why we were alone. The documents in this chest will tell you things I couldn't. Things I should have told you but was too afraid to say out loud. You deserve the truth, even if it destroys the memory you have of me. I'm sorry I wasn't brave enough to tell you while I was alive. I'm sorry for all of it. M. The date at the top of the letter was from last year. She'd written this knowing she was dying. Knowing I'd come back to this house, knowing I'd eventually find it. Or maybe she'd hoped I wouldn't. My hands were shaking as I reached for the other papers in the chest. The first document I pulled out was a birth certificate. Not mine. I'd seen mine before, filed away in her important documents folder downstairs. This was for someone named Margaret Ann Volkoff, born in 1952 in Millbrook, Pennsylvania. My mother had been born in 1952, but her name had always been Margaret Hayes, and she'd told me she was from Ohio. Another lie. I dug deeper. There were photographs, old ones from the 70s and 80s based on the clothes and quality. They showed a young woman who looked like my mother, same sharp cheekbones, same dark eyes, but different somehow. Happier. Less guarded. She was laughing in several of them, surrounded by people I didn't recognize. One photo showed her in a wedding dress, standing next to a man with kind eyes and an easy smile. On the back, written in fading ink, Margaret and Thomas, June 1974. Thomas? A husband I'd never heard of. There were more photos of them together, spanning what looked like several years. Then the photos changed. The man disappeared and my mother Margaret looked different. Thinner. Haunted. In one photo, she was visibly pregnant, her hand resting on her swollen belly, but there was no joy in her expression. I felt sick. I found newspaper clippings next, brittle with age. The headlines made my stomach drop. Local man dies in house fire. Thomas Volkoff, 28, killed in tragic accident. Wife missing after husband's death. The articles were from 1982, from a town called Millbrook, Pennsylvania. They described a house fire that had killed Thomas Volkoff and raised questions about his wife's whereabouts. Police were looking for Margaret Volkoff for questioning. Neighbors reported the couple had been having problems. There were suspicions but no charges. And then she'd vanished. I sat back, my mind reeling. My mother had been married. Her husband had died in a fire. She'd disappeared and changed her identity. And then, a year later, I'd been born. I pulled out more documents, a newspaper clipping from 1983, this time from Ohio, announcing the birth of Daniel Hayes, son of Margaret Hayes. No father listed. Medical records from a hospital in Cleveland. Adoption papers, no, not adoption papers. Legal documents establishing sole custody, but they were strange, incomplete, like pages were missing. And at the bottom of the chest, wrapped in tissue paper, was a small silver locket. I opened it carefully. Inside were two photos. One was of my mother, young and smiling. The other was of a baby. Me. but written on the back of the locket in tiny letters, for Daniel Volkov, born October 15th, 1983. Volkov, not Hayes. I was using my mother's assumed name. My whole life had been built on a lie. I spent the rest of that night going through everything in the chest, spreading it out on the floor of my old bedroom like evidence at a crime scene. By the time the sun rose, I'd pieced together a timeline, but it raised more questions than it answered. Margaret Ann Volkov had married Thomas Volkov in 1974. They'd lived in Millbrook, Pennsylvania, a small town about 4 hours from where I was now. Thomas had worked as a mechanic. Margaret had been a school teacher. In 1982, their house had burned down. Thomas died. Margaret disappeared. In 1983, Margaret Hayes appeared in Cleveland, Ohio, with a newborn son. She'd rented a small apartment, gotten a job as a librarian, and kept to herself. A few years later, she'd moved here, to this house, and we'd lived quietly, isolated, for the rest of her life. But the gaps in the story were enormous. What happened between the fire and my birth? Where had she been for that year? How had she gotten a new identity? And most importantly, who was my father? The obvious assumption was Thomas Volkov. The timeline worked. If she'd been pregnant when he died, I would have been born about 8 months later. But then why run? Why change her name? Why hide everything? Unless she'd had something to do with his death. The thought made me feel like I was betraying her, but I couldn't ignore the implications. The newspaper articles mentioned police suspicions, neighbors who said the couple had been fighting, the timing of her disappearance. What if my mother had killed her husband? What if I was the son of a murderer? I needed answers, and there was only one place to get them. Millbrook, Pennsylvania. I arrived in Millbrook 2 days later, having spent the interim in a frantic state of research. I'd found archived newspaper articles online, learned what I could about the fire and its aftermath, and tracked down an address for the house where it had happened. The town was small, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone and strangers are noticed immediately. I checked into a bed and breakfast run by a woman named Carol, who asked too many questions about why I was visiting. Just doing some genealogy research, I lied. Family history stuff. Oh, how nice. What's your family name? Hayes, I said automatically, then regretted it. If I was going to find the truth, I'd need to use the real name. Actually, Volkov, my grandmother's family. Her expression changed slightly, something flickering across her face. Volkov? That's a name I haven't heard in a long time. You knew them? Knew of them. Before my time, really, but people still talk about the fire. Tragic thing. You're related to them? Distantly, I said, my heart pounding. I'm trying to learn more about what happened. She gave me a sympathetic look. Well, if you want to know more, you should talk to Ruth Castellano. She was Margaret's neighbor back then. Lives over on Willow Street now. She might remember more than most. Ruth Castellano was 83 years old, tiny and bird-like, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. She invited me into her cluttered living room and served me tea I didn't want while studying me with unnerving intensity. You look like her, she said finally, around the eyes. You're her son, aren't you? Margaret's boy? There was no point in lying. Yes, she nodded slowly. I wondered if you'd come eventually, if she'd ever told you. She didn't. She left documents after she died. I'm trying to understand what happened. Ruth was quiet for a long moment, her wrinkled hands wrapped around her teacup. It was a terrible time. Margaret was a sweet girl, really. A good teacher, loved her students. But Thomas had problems. What kind of problems? He drank. Not all the time, but when he did, he got mean. There were bruises on Margaret sometimes, though she always had excuses. We all knew, but back then people didn't interfere the way they might now. It was considered a private matter. I felt cold. He hurt her? He did. And it got worse after she got pregnant. He didn't want children, you see. He was scared he'd be a bad father like his own had been. He wanted her to end the pregnancy. She refused. They fought about it constantly. My hands were shaking. The fire. The official report said it was an electrical fault. Old wiring, started in the basement, spread fast. Thomas was drunk that night, passed out on the couch. He never had a chance. She paused. But Margaret wasn't home. She'd left earlier that evening after a fight, went to stay with a friend across town. When she came back in the morning, the house was gone and Thomas was dead. Was she responsible? Ruth's eyes were sad. The police thought she might have been. The timing was suspicious. She'd left right before the fire, and some people said they'd heard her threaten him earlier that day, said she wished he was dead. But there was never any proof. The electrical fault was real. It could have been an accident. Then why did she run? Because no one believed her. The whole town was whispering, speculating. She was grieving and pregnant and scared, and people were treating her like a criminal. A week after the funeral, she disappeared. Just vanished. Some people thought it proved her guilt. Others thought she couldn't handle the judgment. Ruth leaned forward. I don't know if Margaret set that fire, Daniel. I don't know if she was capable of that. But I know she was desperate. And desperate people do desperate things. She protected you the only way she knew how, by taking you away from here. Away from the gossip and suspicion and starting over. But why not just tell me? Why hide it my whole life? Maybe she was ashamed. Maybe she was scared you'd hate her. Maybe she wanted you to have a life that wasn't defined by tragedy and suspicion. Ruth reached out and patted my hand. Your mother and she was your mother. Regardless of what name she used, she loved you. I'm certain of that. I wanted to believe her. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. I spent another day in Millbrook, visiting the library, reading old newspaper archives, talking to anyone who remembered the Volkovs. The picture that emerged was consistent. Thomas had been troubled, violent, and alcoholic. Margaret had been a victim trying to survive. The fire had been convenient timing, perhaps too convenient, but ultimately ruled accidental. But there was one detail that nagged at me. Several people mentioned that Margaret had left town with the baby. But I hadn't been born yet when she disappeared. I was born 8 months later, in October 1983. She'd left Millbrook in March 1982. That timeline didn't work. I went back to the library and requested birth records from the county. It took some convincing and a small bribe to the clerk, but eventually I got what I needed. There, in the records from Millbrook Community Hospital, was a birth certificate dated November 17, 1982. Mother, Margaret Ann Volkov. Father, Thomas Volkov. Child, Daniel Thomas Volkov. I stared at the paper, my hands numb. I'd been born 2 months after the fire. Born in Millbrook, not Cleveland. Born while my mother was still here, still under suspicion, still Margaret Volkov. So when had she left? And why did my official birth certificate, the one I'd seen all my life, say I was born in Cleveland in October 1983, almost a year later? The answer came from an unexpected source. I was having dinner at a local diner, picking at food I couldn't taste, when an old man approached my table. He was in his 70s, weathered and gruff, with the look of someone who'd worked hard his whole life. You're asking about Margaret Volkov, he said without preamble. I heard you've been talking to folks. I am. Did you know her? I knew Thomas. Worked with him at the garage. Good mechanic when he was sober, which wasn't often enough. He pulled out a chair and sat down without being invited. I'm John Pritchard. I've got something to tell you, if you want to hear it. Please. He was quiet for a moment, ordering coffee from the waitress before continuing. Thomas died in that fire, that's true. But Margaret didn't kill him. I know, because I was with her that night. I stared at him. What? She called me, late, around 11. Said Thomas had been drinking, had gotten violent, and she was scared for the baby. I drove over, picked her up, brought her to my place. My wife, she's gone now, God rest her. She put Margaret in the guest room. We were going to help her figure things out. Maybe get her to a women's shelter the next day. So she was with you when the fire started? She was. I told the police that. Gave her an alibi. But by then, the rumors had already started and people didn't want to believe it. They wanted the dramatic story. The scorned wife who killed her husband. The truth was boring. Just a drunk who fell asleep with a lit cigarette near faulty wiring. Then why did she run? John's expression darkened. Because of Thomas's brother. The air seemed to leave the room. Brother? Yeah, David Volkov. Nasty piece of work, made Thomas look like a saint. He came around after the fire, making threats. Said Margaret had killed his brother, said she'd pay for it. Said he'd take the baby, raise it himself, make sure it knew what kind of mother it had. My blood ran cold. He threatened her? More than threatened. He tried to take you. Broke into the hospital when you were just a few days old, tried to walk out with you. Security stopped him, but Margaret was terrified. She knew he wasn't going to stop, so she did what she had to do. She ran. She ran, and she erased herself. Got help from someone I don't know who, some kind of underground network for women escaping domestic violence, and disappeared. Changed her name, got new documents, moved far away. She did what she had to do to keep you safe. I felt like I was drowning. Where is he now? David Volkov? Dead. Killed in a bar fight about 10 years ago. Died the way he lived. Angry and violent. Relief washed over me, followed immediately by guilt for feeling relieved about someone's death. Does this mean... I started, then stopped, trying to organize my thoughts. The birth certificate that says I was born in Cleveland a year later, that's fake? Probably. I don't know the details of how she did it, but yeah. Your real birth certificate is the one from here. You were born in Millbrook, right after your father died, and your mother took you and ran. He stood up, leaving money on the table for his coffee. I'm sorry you had to find out this way. Margaret was a good person in an impossible situation. She did the best she could. I drove back to my mother's house. My house now, I supposed. In a daze. It was late when I arrived, past midnight, and the old Victorian looked haunted in the darkness. Inside, I went back to my bedroom, back to the chest of documents spread across the floor. I looked at everything with new eyes, seeing the pieces differently now that I understood the context. My mother hadn't been a murderer. She'd been a victim who'd escaped, who'd protected her child from a violent family, who'd sacrificed everything, her identity, her past, her connections to keep me safe. The secrecy, the isolation, the way she'd kept me at arm's length emotionally, it all made sense now. She'd been living in fear for 37 years, always looking over her shoulder, always worried that somehow someone would find us. I found the journal I'd seen in the chest, but hadn't read yet. It was my mother's, entries spanning years. I opened it to a random page, dated from when I was about 10 years old. Daniel asked about his father again today. It breaks my heart to lie to him, but what can I say? Your father was violent and I was relieved when he died. Your uncle tried to kidnap you as a baby and I've been hiding ever since? How do you explain that to a child? He deserves better than this. Better than a mother who can't tell him the truth, who can't let him get too close to anyone, who moves them every few years just to be safe. But I don't know how to give him better without risking everything. I hope someday he'll understand. I hope someday he'll forgive me. I closed the journal, tears running down my face. She'd spent my entire childhood protecting me from a threat I never knew existed. She'd lived in isolation and fear so that I could be safe. And she'd never told me, never burdened me with that knowledge, never asked for my gratitude or understanding. She'd just loved me, the only way she knew how. I spent the next week going through the rest of the house more carefully, finding other hidden things, letters she'd written but never sent, explaining everything. Photos of me as a baby that I'd never seen, taken during those first few weeks in Millbrook before we ran. A safety deposit box key that led me to more documents, including legal papers establishing her new identity. I learned that she'd worked with a women's shelter network that helped domestic violence victims disappear. They'd given her a new name, new documents, a new life. It was technically illegal, but it had saved us. I learned that she'd checked every few years to see if David Volkov was still alive, still a threat. The relief she must have felt when he died 10 years ago, knowing we were finally safe, I could only imagine. And I learned, through her journals and letters, how much she'd loved me, how every sacrifice had been worth it, how her only regret was that she couldn't give me a normal childhood, a life without secrets. I found one final letter, dated just a month before she died. Daniel, if you're reading this, you know everything now. I hope you don't hate me. I hope you understand that everything I did was to protect you. You were the best thing that ever happened to me. You were the reason I survived, The reason I kept going even when I wanted to give up. You were always my son, my beautiful boy, and nothing about the circumstances of your birth changes that. I know I wasn't the warmest mother. I know I kept you at a distance emotionally. I was so afraid of losing you that I never let myself get too close, never let myself be vulnerable. That was my failure, not yours. You deserved better. You deserved a mother who could love you openly, who could tell you the truth, who could give you a normal life. I'm sorry I couldn't be that person. But I want you to know, every difficult choice I made, every lie I told, every secret I kept, it was all for you. You were safe. You were loved. You were worth everything. Live your life, Daniel. Be happy. Be free. Be everything I couldn't be. I love you more than you'll ever know. Mom. 3 months later, I'm still in the house. I'd planned to sell it, to go back to my life in the city and try to forget all of this. But I couldn't. This house, for all its secrets and shadows, was my mother's refuge. It was where she'd finally felt safe enough to stop running. It was where she'd raised me, protected me, loved me in her careful, guarded way. I've started renovating it, fixing the things that need fixing, updating the things that need updating, but keeping the bones of it intact. The floorboard where I found the chest, I've left it loose, as a reminder. I've also started reaching out to the few people who knew Margaret Volkoff, who remembered her as the young teacher she'd been before everything fell apart. I'm piecing together a more complete picture of who she was, beyond the frightened woman who raised me. And I've been writing down everything I learned, everything I felt, trying to make sense of a life built on necessary lies. The truth didn't destroy me, the way her note warned it might. It freed me. Because now I understand. I understand why she was the way she was. I understand the weight she carried. I understand that love doesn't always look warm and open. Sometimes it looks like sacrifice. Sometimes it looks like secrets kept and distances maintained. Sometimes it looks like a mother who gives up everything, her identity, her past, her connections to keep her child safe. She wasn't perfect. She made choices that hurt us both in different ways. But she was brave, and she was strong, and she loved me the only way she knew how. That's enough. It has to be enough. Because we found a locked chest beneath the floorboards, and the note inside said, "My mother wasn't who I thought she was." And it was right. She was so much more.